With the last movie of this chapter, I'd like to show you how you can use Camera Raw to edit a JPEG image. So let's go ahead in here and we'll double click in the Chapter 8 folder in Bridge, and then we're going to double click on the Camera Raw TIFF and JPEG folder. Now you can edit both JPEGs and TIFFs in Camera Raw if you have a certain preference turned on here in Bridge. I'm going to go ahead and show you that preference. If I press Command K on the Mac or Control K in Windows, that brings up our preferences dialog box, just like it does in Photoshop or InDesign or just about every application in the Creative Suite. And notice here in the thumbnails panel, we have this option. It says prefer Adobe Camera Raw for JPEG and TIFF files. And if we turn that on, that means that if we should double click the image, since we in the general panel have double click edits Camera Raw settings in Bridge, that means it will launch the Camera Raw dialog box here in Bridge instead of in Photoshop, and it will do so for a selected JPEG or TIFF image. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. With these settings applied, I'm going to go ahead and select this, double click the tower1.jpg image to open it up in Camera Raw. Okay, now if you've been watching these movies and following along, you may recognize this image because we did quite a bit of editing to it in the Photoshop work environment. We used shadow highlights, we used curves, we used selective color, we used hue saturation, and we did all of that non-destructively in order to correct this image. What we're going to do now is do some similar adjustments, only we're going to do all of them here in Camera Raw. And these still would be editable adjustments, meaning that we can always go back to the settings and change them. Okay, just like it is with Camera Raw files, we can save our settings in this file here and then return to them, go back to the original image, and then adjust our settings at any time. Okay, they're not actually applied until we click Open Image and then open the image into Photoshop. So it's an interesting way to work with JPEGs and TIFFs, and it is a viable workflow for designers that are working with a lot of JPEG and TIFF images that they may get from photographers that they're working with, or maybe if they're taking their own images. So let's take a look at what we can do here. If you notice here on the right, we have, of course, our exposure slider, so we can lighten this up just a little bit by dragging it to the right. And we have these recovery and fill light sliders. Now these are kind of like Camera Raw's equivalent of working with the shadow highlight sliders in the shadow highlight adjustment dialog box. The fill light is like working with the shadow slider. If I drag this to the right, it's going to lighten up the shadow areas, just like in shadow highlights. And recovery is like working with the highlights. Okay, so if I were to drag that over, that would darken up the highlights, which I don't think we necessarily need to do with this image, but I wanted you to know that these are the equivalents of those same controls in the shadow highlights dialog box. Okay, what else can we do here? We can go into our curves, tone curve here. Rather than working with parametric curves, I think since I'm more comfortable with point curves and what I'm used to working with, I'm going to go to the point curve tab. It's currently set to linear, but we can make some changes to this. We can do the same sort of thing like we do when we're working with curves in Photoshop. We can hold down the Command key or the Control key in Windows. And as we do, you can notice that the little circle is appearing over the baseline in the curves grid over here. So as I hover in the image with that key held down, we can see where I am in the image and where it's placed along the curve. Okay, and we also have a histogram in there that we can refer to, which is kind of nice. So let's see, I can select, say, something lighter like this sky image here, or maybe let's select in this white area in here and go ahead and move that up a few notches using the up arrow key to lighten it. And we can select a dark area, like maybe this flag, which we'd like to remain dark. And we can move that down to set up our curves adjustment. We're already getting nicer contrast. As you can see, let's see if we can go. Maybe another area like here is getting a little too dark. So we'll bring that back up to the baseline by using the up arrow key. Wait a couple seconds for it to update. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so there's a custom adjustment you can make. There's something else you consider is that we have these defaults, the medium contrast and strong contrast presets. So if we want to, before we even start clicking and moving points along the curve, we can always choose one of these presets and see what happens there. And that actually looks pretty good. Now, if we wanted to, we could adjust these points to taste, season to taste, but use that as a nice starting point. Sometimes that's a quicker and faster way to work. It's sometimes a little bit more productive, especially if you're really trying to blaze through these pretty quick. I use these quite a bit, actually. I recommend checking out those presets, strong contrast and medium contrast. Maybe try those first before you start actually applying custom curve settings here in Camera Raw. All right, something else we can do is go into the HSL Grayscale tab, maybe bump up some saturation for some of these individual colors. We can go in here, maybe bump up the oranges a bit, bump up the reds and the golds to make these guys stand out the way we want, just make them a little bit more vibrant. Notice also in the basic tab, we have a vibrance slider and a saturation slider. So we could increase the saturation of the entire image overall by increasing the saturation slider. This is a lot like working with the hue saturation dialog box in the Photoshop work environment. And vibrance, the difference between vibrance and saturation is vibrance works a lot better with skin tones. So if you're actually adjusting an image that contains people, you may want to stick with vibrance. Some people just use vibrance. They never even mess with saturation. They just keep this guy set to 0, and they just use vibrance all the time because they just consider it to be a better all-around saturation adjustment. So you may want to try that, especially if you're working with images of people. Okay, we also have a brightness slider, so if we want to try and brighten up the white areas a little bit more like we did in the selective color movie, I'm going to go ahead and increase the brightness just a little bit to lighten that up. And you can see we're pretty much done. And we did all of that right here in Camera Raw. All of our controls are right here at our fingertips using these different panels. And we did so to a JPEG image rather than a Camera Raw image. So I encourage you to try this out now that you know how these different controls work in Camera Raw, how they compare to the controls that are available in the Photoshop workspace. I say go ahead, give it a shot. What you're lacking here, as opposed to working in the Photoshop workspace, is you don't have layers, of course. We don't have adjustment layers. We don't have filters. We don't have brushes. So there's definitely some limitations. But I think for making tonal adjustments and enhancing color, Camera Raw is a wonderful tool. And I recommend that you try these out. Try it out on your JPEGs and your TIFFs because it can really save you some time.